Grüß, willkommen in einem and in a freaking video. Welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case part 14 of my Star Trek TOS timeline series of videos. In this video I'll be discussing the size of the Federation and determine how large is the Federation. It must be noted that it's impossible to determine the size of the Federation with any level of accuracy with the material in the TV episode. The producers were not trying to achieve any level of scientific accuracy, but we can derive some appropriate Federation sizes which allow for the episodes to occur as they did. In the 3 seasons of Star Trek, the original series, we are introduced to a number of different planet types. As you can see from the list, the most numerous Federation planets are human Federation member planets. We can also see 24 human colony planets and at least 15 alien planets which are members of the Federation. This ratio did change a lot during the seasons, with human colony planets being dominant in Season 1, but this gives us a better idea of the composition of the Federation, with a reasonable number of alien full Federation planets as well. The only issue is the number of mining and farming planets seem rather low. The number of colony planets seem a bit low as well. As these type of planets are not as important as full member planets, the Enterprise may not spend that much time visiting them. We can get an idea of the correct numbers by looking at the estimate of all the planets in the Federation. There are sources which claim there are 700 colony planets, or perhaps systems, and 150 member planets in the Federation, which gives us a ratio of about 4 to 5 smaller planets for each full member planet. Based on the ratios arrived at during the 3 seasons, there are probably another 200 human mining, farming, research planets, as well as what is listed. But, of course, this was in areas that the Enterprise never visited and thus were never mentioned in any of the episodes. These do not have a large population, but all these planets are inhabited in some manner. As a side note, if the Enterprise has identified 41 full member planets from a total of 150, it's covering a lot of volume, which is slightly more than 25% of the entire volume of the Federation. However, this comparison may be misleading, as the Enterprise would spend most of the time at the edge of Federation space, where the density of full member planets would be lower. My personal theory is 5 years represented the Enterprise circumventing or circumnavigating entire Federation space, but I really have no evidence if this is the case or not. Next question we may wish to ask is, what density of systems should we be expecting? If the Enterprise travels for 2 weeks in each episode and averages 400 times light speed, it could travel 15 light years. If it went faster, this could move up to 30 light years, which may be more reasonable. If we assume it reaches 1 planet each episode, then the average distance between systems could be about, let's say, 30 light years. This is a much greater density than my earlier estimate, but once I discovered the Federation could span 1,800 by 1,800 by 1,000 light years, I needed a reduced density of systems. Based on this distant estimate, the area a system occupies is about 27 square light years. If we're dealing with 1,000 systems, the Federation needs to be at least 270 million square light years in volume. This gives us a Federation which spans 200 light years in all directions from Earth. This is too small, as we do know that we reached the top of the galactic edge. So we have to assume the planetary density is not uniform, and the distance in the square of Gothos, for example, is actually 450 light years and not 900 light years. The probable size of the Federation in 2264 is probably 400 to 450 light year radius from Earth in all directions on average. Obviously, any expansion in the direction of the Romulans has stopped, so the border of the Federation will not be a uniform sphere. This is required to avoid the system density being too low. The border is marked by the neutral zone, and we do have a map of the neutral zone, but we are unaware of its scale. This expansion would have stopped in 2160. There must also be a border with the Klingons, where any expansion has stopped as well. I suspect the Federation and Klingons first met in 2242, thus expansion in that direction would have stopped about that year. The map we possess of the Earth-Romulan neutral zone does not have a scale, but we see 2 Romulan systems close to each other. If this is 30 light years as per our average, then each square represents a 30 light year square. The neutral zone shown would be 300 light years in length. Romulus is within 120 light years of the neutral zone, which seems rather close. As we know in the Balance of Terror, the Enterprise came up from the lower edge, and Earth is certainly not in this map. This indicates the Earth Empire, or Federation, is much larger than the Romulan Star Empire. There is only one explanation for Romulus being so close to the neutral zone, and that is the Romulans were losing the war and had lost territory, which is why the war ended. We are moving into wild guess territory now, but this could be a reasonable view of the border between the Romulans and Federations if the Romulans were actually not losing the war. The Enterprise may have been moving from a position closer to Earth when it got the message of the attack in the Balance of Terror. In this map, Romulus is not in the centre, so clearly this assumption must be wrong. If the Star Empire was larger and Earth pushed them back, we can get Romulus where it needs to be, in the centre. Thus, that must be the case. This is the more likely scenario, which assumes the Romulans were losing the war and were being pushed back. The yellow line represents the start position before the war. Both sides would be equal in strength. This is a map dated 2264. The areas controlled would have been smaller before the war in 2150. In 2150, both sides would have been about 200 light years in all directions from their capital planet, or half the size compared with 2260 at 400 light years in all directions, as shown here. Earth must have pushed the border back into Romulan territory when the war ended. This makes sense, as the Romulans would probably only make peace if it was losing, as the humans would have been in a looser confederation, so they probably would have been rather happy with peace and would be happy with the extra systems that it had under its control. This also explains why the neutral zone is so close to Romulus and so far away from Earth. If this is correct, it becomes obvious the Federation-Klingon border must be on the top or bottom of this map. I feel the Klingons and Romulans must also have a border. The top of the map is the logical location, but the maps which are commonly used on the internet indicate it must be on the bottom. So, as long as it does not conflict with TOS canon, I will take whatever other fans have assumed. Later I discovered this was a very good call for a host of other reasons, so the fans did actually get it right, and my obvious choice at the top was clearly wrong. I really have no good idea where the Vulcans would be located. They would need to be far away from the Romulans, otherwise they would have discovered that they were related. The best position is on the other side of the Earth, at least 200 light years away. That means that when the Romulans expanded, they met the humans well before they met the Vulcans, so this kind of makes sense. You may now ask, what about the third dimension? The galaxy is only 1,000 light years deep at this point, so while the various nations may be centred on slightly different planes, they could not be above or below each other. We know Earth sent a ship to the North Galactic Barrier, or at least the North is the closest galactic barrier, thus I assume that's where it went. Thus, there is no one north of Earth, and Earth is at the centre from the side. If the Romulans were below Earth, they would not have enough space to create a star empire 400 or 800 light years across. Once we start moving into sizes of 800 light years across, we really are in a two-dimensional world in the galaxy, particularly at this point. Earth is probably somewhere around the position of the arrow, and while it looks thicker, the useful galaxy is only 1,000 light years thick. Beyond that, the systems are very far apart and beyond the protection of the galactic magnetic field, which probably would be a very unhealthy place to live. This is a map from another SPI board game. In this case, each hex represents 1,000 light years. It's not possible to see, but Sol is on the left and in the centre, which is shown by my white arrow. The interesting point about this map is the galaxy is about 1,000 light years thick at the point Sol occupies, which means there is no depth in the map. If the Federation extends 400 light years in all directions from Earth, it would not even take up a single hex. This shows a zoomed-in image of the galaxy around Sol. The density of stars in each 1,000 square light-year hex is shown, with gold being the highest, silver the next, and black representing a low star density. Sol is close to an edge of the Sagittarius-Carina arm, so it's likely the Romulans occupy the grey or silver hex to the right, the upper one, and the Klingons occupy the lower hex. This is a wild guess as to have almost no value, but represents a viable attempt to determine where the Federation exists in the real galaxy. As a bit of a side note, in the next generation, the Federation is supposed to be 18,000 light years across when it was formed, which would represent 18 hexes. Unless warp speed is a lot faster than I'm estimated, this is very unlikely. A more viable estimate is 1800 light years in all directions from Earth. But then we have a problem that we push the Romulans and Klingons off the Cygnus Canera arm, and they're actually existing in a very low dense area of stars. There are about 250 billion stars in the galaxy. This gives us a density of about 40,000 square light years per star. As the density of stars around Sol is closer to 1,000 square light years per star, there is a lot of empty space in the galaxy. This explains the low density black X's on the map, where the system density is very low and not suitable for building up an empire. There are about 52 systems within 16.3 light years of Sol. 50 are red dwarfs and the rest are larger suns, such as our own. There are also 4 white dwarfs and 4 brown dwarfs. If our federation of about 1,000 systems span 400 light years in all directions from Earth, there are 63,000 systems which are not occupied by the Federation. If we only look at the larger suns, there are about 9,000 systems which are not occupied by the Federation. I suppose if the Federation only occupied planets which are habitable and very, very good habitable planets, then it's possible only 1 in 6 or 1 in 10 systems are colonised. But if anyone ever decides to go down the path of terraforming, there is no lack of suitable systems. This map probably represents the Earth and Romulan Star Empire territories at the beginning of the war. When Earth went to war with the Romulans, the overwhelming bulk of their military power would be in Sol, around Earth and Mars, and the rest would be mainly in Alpha Centauri, which only be a rounding error. The rest of the planets represent very little military potential, if anything, apart from maybe minimal defences. I'd assume the same would apply with the Romulans, who only have Romulus, Remus and Romy against Earth, Mars and Alpha Centauri. If the Romulans attacked, they would have found it easy to advance at least 100 light years, if not more, as there was almost no Federation planets of any value in that area. However, as they got close to Alpha Centauri and Earth, the situation would have changed. Even if Alpha Centauri may not have been an immediate threat, some of the colony planets would have achieved a population of 1 million, which would have been too difficult to evacuate. There could be as many as 6 of these planets, and 2 or 3 would have been threatened if the Romulans' advance moved really much further. Earth would have conducted delaying actions that attempted to attrit the Romulans down as much as possible, trading space for time. Logistics would have also been on their side. This would have also allowed it to assemble its entire fleet and possibly some allies, although I suspect at this stage of the war Earth had no effective allies. The result would have been a Romulan defeat and a slow and steady advance of the Earth forces. With the Romulans on the run, I suspect allies would have provided assistance, especially the Vulcans. Thus the Terrans would have been able to retake its own territory within a year and started an advance into Romulan territory, which would have resulted in peace when it began to threaten core Romulan worlds. This probably represents the final border between the two territories at the end of the war. The Romulans may have had some colony worlds of 1 million threatened if Earth had advanced any further, which would have been the trigger for them to sue for peace. It's possible when the Federation was formed in 2161, the blue sphere would have grown. However, it's likely that apart from the Vulcans, there were few non-human planets in the Federation at this point in time. If the Federation resulted in a significantly more powerful enemy, the Romulans would have been totally outmatched and they would have never tried to provoke the Federation 100 years later. The only wild card is the mysterious allies mentioned in the Balance of Terror, but I suspect they may be Vulcans, or, as we'll see in a later video, a mysterious ally that was in between the United Earth and Romulans, which may have been the reason why the war went the way it went. That is, both sides never actually physically saw each other. After an additional 100 years of expansion, this probably represents the border in 2260, which is shortly before Kirk's 5-year mission. In Errant of Mercy, the Federation and Klingons go to war. As it turned out, apart from a small skirmish with the Enterprise, there was no combat as the Organians stopped the war. While there was no war, we have a few clues which may allow us to position the Klingon Empire from this episode. The first point is most later sources state the Klingons and Romulans have a border. This means the Klingons must be forward or in the rear of the Romulans, with a small border with the Federation. Most of the later source maps have the Klingons in the galactic rear position. The galaxy rotates in a clockwise direction using the top-bottom orientation, which I assume has been used. If you reverse the orientation, look at it from the bottom up to the top, the direction is anti-clockwise. I'm using the direction, as I'm uncertain which direction we're actually viewing the galaxy, I'm using the direction of the arms trails as my guide on my maps, and that determines my top and bottom position accordingly. The space between the Federation and Klingons was a type of neutral void with only one Class M planet in it. This tells us both spheres were only just touching each other in 2264. It's probable that Klingons may be closer to the Romulans and may have even taken some territory in some kind of minor skirmish in, I estimate, 2240. There's no good proof this occurred, but this may explain why they do not get together to defeat the Federation. There is a high probability the Klingons and Federation fought a limited war sometime before 2264. Most likely it was after 2245, but for our exercise I'll assume it's in the 2242 to 2245 range. This was likely the Battle of Donat 5 mentioned in Troubles with Tribbles. I lack detail, but this was likely a Klingon subject nation attacking a Federation allied system, which later became part of the Federation. Both sides tried to limit the war, and the closest analogy that I can think of was the North Korean invasion of South Korea, the involvement of the UN forces and then China's involvement, which in the Star Trek universe would have been the Klingon forces. Because the fighting was between clients or allied systems, it would not be in the respective Federation or Klingon spheres of influence, but was probably close to the Federation border. This could have occurred on either side of Organia, and beyond any void. It's quite possible that this war was finished or ended when the Battle of Axanar occurred. If we look at the galaxy from its side, all three home planets of the Federation, Klingons and Romulans would have probably been on a similar plane within the galaxy. There may have been some variation, no more than 100 light years I would estimate, but within the variation it would have been similar. The reason is any system in the centre plane of the galactic armour would be able to expand in all directions, up and down as well, and have a major advantage. Earth is 10 to 20 light years north of the galactic plane, so the other two home planets must be similar, otherwise they would be at a disadvantage if they wanted to expand. It's entirely possible that Romulans and Klingons did have a disadvantage, which is why the Federation is so economically powerful, but as they are on the edge of their respective galactic arms, they already possess a significant disadvantage compared with Earth because of a lack of star density, so I'm assuming they are all on the similar plane, as having two major disadvantages just is too much. This could be the position of the three empires at the start of the Earth-Romulan War, which explains why the Klingons were not involved. This pretty much kills the theory the Klingons were somehow involved in that war. There may have been some minor skirmishing between 2240 between the Klingons and Romulans as they expanded into each other's space, but that's about the only conflict that I could think of that occurred before the Organian conflict. Hostility would have kept them from joining together against the Federation in 2150, which is why I really do strongly believe there was a minor war between the Klingons and the Romulans sometime around about the 2240 zone or period. All this is guesswork, but if these assumptions are correct, we could make an estimate of the size of the Federation when warp drive was first invented. We know Earth had colonies on Alpha Centauri when warp was invented and had sent exploration ships out as far as 400 light years away. It seems reasonable the size of the Earth territory was possibly 50 light years in all directions from Earth in 2060. Key technology is impulse drive. Once Earth had created impulse drive, they would have quickly expanded in all directions. A sphere 50 light years in all directions from Earth would give the Earth 15 systems based on our Federation density. At least 5 would be mining or farming planets, giving us 10 population or agricultural systems. Impulse drive was probably first invented in 2018. Then the Earth would have had 40 years to colonise 10 systems. None would be more than a simple farming colony planet, apart from Alpha Centauri. Just to emphasise, it must be remembered the Star Trek universe, as envisaged in 1966, is not our universe. We can assume history is correct up to the 1966 period, but beyond that we are in a different timeline. Considering all the meddling which occurred in the late 1960s by the Enterprise, I'm not surprised. The 2 trips back by the Enterprise probably created a new timeline, and if Kirk did not lose his girlfriend back in the 1930s, there would have been an even bigger timeline change back in the 30s. Time travel is dangerous and needs to be avoided at all costs. In the Star Trek universe, there are 3 expanding races: the humans, Romulans and Klingons. Most other races only have their own home planet, or at the very most, a few colony worlds. The Vulcans are unique, they have logic, and they have determined that unsustained expansion has no benefit, or perhaps their birth rate is very low. The other races could be technologically behind the 3 leading races and would have expanded if the humans, Klingons and Romulans were not there first. The only exception is the First Federation. But that seems to be a small collection of systems which have remained reasonably stable. I personally feel that colonisation in the way that the humans have undertaken is simply a very unusual course of action for any civilization, which is why the humans are rather unique. The Klingons and Romulans have probably gone down the path of conquering any other alien race they have, and thus they can basically occupy those planets with minimal military force, and so they achieve their expansion in a completely different way. Pure guesswork, but that's basically my conclusion. However, apart from this difference, the real wild card is we have 3 races all expanding at a similar rate, both in terms of economic power and technology. Federation becomes economically more powerful than the Klingons because the humans managed to get a bunch of other races to join it in 2160, especially the Vulcans. But apart from this, it's probably similar in total power to each of the other 2 races. In terms of probability, this situation is very unlikely, but I suppose not impossible. I suspect that these seeders may be a factor in this. I briefly mentioned this in the past, but density of systems may be a critical factor as well. If we assume all planets started expanding at the same time, then there is a reason why the humans became more powerful, at least economically. The easiest explanation is the humans either started expanding earlier or expanding into more economically valuable territory. The latter is the best explanation, but the former is not impossible, although unlikely. I'll go with the high density of suitable sun theory, which is a reasonable considering the position of all the home planets. As you can see, the Earth and Vulcan is in a higher density of system area of this particular galactic arm than the Klingons and Romulans. To compensate for their economic weakness, both Romulans and Klingons focus more on military power, which is a viable strategy if they feel they are facing an economically more powerful nation, which stands in their way, and any nice juicy systems and resources that they may wish to take over. This is a very late map of the Federation. Apart from the Cardassians, which do not exist in the original series, this is kind of similar to my estimate of the various territories. Because the Federation border with the Romulans and Klingons no longer moves, it squeezes down and upwards to make up for it. This is a good map for our TOS timeline, if we exclude the Cardassian unit, which did not exist in the original series. And so we come to an end of my part 14 of my Star Trek TOS timeline, in this case trying to determine the size of the Federation. The episode scripts can be found using the URL shown. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.